Some examples of the types of texts. If we take science, it works with reports. Why? Why does science typically use reports? It's because it's based on observations from the real world, and then it produces generalizations from these observations, which is followed by information. So the kind of text that is usually produced is what we call a report. If we go to a subject like English, it typically works with narratives, or what we call stories. It draws on imagination, and usually it has some kind of orientation, some kind of beginning, and then a complication that makes the narrative interesting and exciting, and then some kind of resolution. So narratives typically have these three big types of events in their structure. If we go to a subject like history, it tends to want to make a case about events in time and space. So what it does is it provides evidence, it makes a case, and it has a conclusion about a particular historic event and its meaning. Each one of these approaches to writing, reports, narratives, and arguments, they're called genres. They're types of purposes, and they're associated with different types of subjects and different types of purposes in the real world. Each has a different purpose, and each has a different structure. And I'm going to just try one little example. Imagine you've a teenager, you've got a new car, you want to buy fat tires for your car, those speedy fat tires. Which genre would you use, for example? Would you use a report? Would you go to your parents and say, well, fat tires are made of rubber and they're this wide and they can be bought here, there, and somewhere else? Would you give them a report like that? Perhaps you might give them a narrative. Perhaps you have a story about how fat tires on a car produce excitement and kids like them and they're really cool. Would that work? Or perhaps you might draw on the genre of argument where you might want to make a case of why fat tires would make your car safer and how it would be better to have them, and conclude that your parents would be better off because it might be cheaper to have fat tires than other tires because they last longer. But you can see that each purpose, even related to the same thing, purchasing fat tires, requires a different genre depending on what you want to achieve. So if you want your parents to buy them, a report or a narrative will not work as well as an argument.
I'm going to go through some examples of these kinds of texts. And when we say that, functional literacy pedagogy is about powerful texts in school, in fact, it's not just the subject of English language arts that, or language learning or literacy narrowly conceived, where these kinds of texts appear. They appear in science in the form of a report. So what a report does, a science report does, it provides structured information about the natural world, for example, based on information. So it's informationally focused. That in English, we might write narratives, things which tell a story. They have characters and settings, and there's a complication at a certain point, and there's a resolution of the story at the end. And in history, we might mount an argument, which is, what were the causes of the First World War? Well, this might be a cause, and that might be a cause. We make a number of claims about the causes, and we might support those causes with historical evidence. And at the end, we might draw an interpretive conclusion. So these are, if you like, ways of representing knowledge, not just literacy knowledge as form within the literacy class, but knowledge in other subject areas as well. In that sense, these are incredibly powerful, important parts of learning at school, particularly from about the middle school through to the high school. So, how do some of these kind of text types look? Well, let's take a narrative. So what we do in narratives is we typically tell imaginary stories for entertainment, or in the case of fables, they might have a kind of a moral to them. And there are macro structures which involve an orientation. Who are the characters? Where's the setting? That as the story, a number of things happen, usually across time, and then there's a complication. And there's a kind of a mystery in what's going to happen next. Then there's a resolution to that complication, and perhaps a reorientation or a coda, which clarifies in a kind of way what the purpose of the story was. Now they're the macro structures within a text. So remember, with the functional approach, we start with the whole text and we work down from the whole text and the structure of the whole text into microstructures. So who are the characters? What's the setting? What's the interpersonal tenor? You know, who's the narrator? How is time represented? Tenses in the activity sequence. How is dialogue represented? So we have all these microstructures which we can talk about explicitly in terms of understanding the way in which narrative texts work. To take another genre at the moment, and the word we use to describe these text types is genre, a report. So let's say we've got a factual text describing a natural, technical or social phenomena, and this might happen in science, it might happen in social studies, in a number of, and of course it happens all the time in the real world. There are real world reports all the time which have fairly predictable kinds of generic structures. So here's the macro structure: a general classification and then a series of descriptions of aspects or parts or functions or qualities of the thing which is generally described, which might be, you know, an animal or a motor car or whatever it is that you're writing a report about. So, and what are the microstructures? Well, they're often generic participants. It's about crocodiles in general, as opposed to Fred the crocodile. It's about cars in general, as opposed to my car. That there's not a temporal sequence. I mean, narratives are very much driven by temporal sequence. It's not a temporal sequence. And there are a lot of being and having clauses of presence, if you like. And processes are often turned into things. So in other words, there's a lot of action in a narrative, but what we do is we speak about these things as having thing-like quality. So those actions are often described in abstract terms, and there's a focus on general states. Now, so in other words, what we have in here is a quite peculiar type of text, starting with the macro structure, which is what's the overall structure of the text, down to the detailed microstructures.